Welcome to our second in the series of 2 classes on parting from the 4 attachments. Glad to have everybody here. And once again, I feel humbled and honored to be sitting in front of all of you, teaching and sharing a little bit of knowledge that I have. And I'm sure I will learn just as much from all of you as you do from me. And hopefully we'll have some time for good questions and discussions towards the end. I wanted to start off today just by saying this is only 2 sessions. It's a very profound topic of pith instructions. So in essence, this is an overview of what these teachings are. They're not at all an in-depth teaching, but maybe something that will spur your interest and get you excited about these teachings as well. And maybe to start off with a little bit of what we talked about last week. These teachings are a Sakya tradition teaching developed by a Sakya master who at the age of 12 went into retreat and had a vision of Manjushri. And via Manjushri was given these pith instructions of the parting from the 4 attachments. So that's 4 verses, very pith, very short, and packed with a lot of information. And just to remind us all of what those 4 attachments are, what those 4 partings are, they're a series that start with, if you're attached to this life, you are not a true spiritual practitioner. If you are attached to samsara, you have no renunciation. If you are attached to your own self-interest, you have no bodhicitta. And if you are attached, if grasping fixation arises, you do not have the view. At first glance, it doesn't seem like there's a lot going on there, but as with most Tibetan Buddhist teachings, you can pull that apart and look at every word if you so choose. If we did that, we'd probably be here for 2 months and we'd need someone else sitting in this seat. But as it is, I'll try to give you some essence of what those are and review a little bit of what we talked about last time. So if you take a look at that, and I know they're on the handouts of the morning prayers that I did just hand out, you could take a look at that as well. But basically, what are the 4 attachments we're talking about when we're looking at the 4 verses? The first one is being attached to this life. The second is being attached to samsara. The third is being attached to your own self-interest. And the 4th is any attachment that arises in the view. So there's 4 attachments that we're being asked to tackle and grasp at and grapple with and think about and say, what does this mean to us? And one way to look at that is that those attachments are related to our path. And in some sense, they tell us when we have grasping at each of those levels, there's some place on the path that we're either getting stuck or we are working on. So if you have attachment to this life, we talked about that last time, that means you're basically out in the world. You're concerned more with worldly affairs than you are with your internal spiritual development. So if you're grasping at this life, you're not a true spiritual practitioner. So that means we need to take a look at what that looks like in our daily life. The second attachment is if you're attached to samsara, then you have no renunciation. So once you've taken a look at the worldly life, you've started looking inwardly. The next thing is how do you develop a path? And that path is then when you walk onto the hinayana path and you develop renunciation. Once you have renunciation, you've dedicated your life to looking inwardly, to have a spiritual path. The next phase is to look at, okay, I'm dedicated to getting enlightenment. Now I need to expand that dedication a little bit further instead of just being concerned with my own self-interest, being attached to my own self-interest. How do I develop that spiritual path a little bit further? Well, it's by letting go of that grasping to myself and my own needs and expanding that out to all sentient beings, being more interested in the welfare of others and their attainment of spiritual enlightenment than my own. So once we've tackled that attachment, the final attachment is any attachment that arises at all, any grasping to things as being truly existent. And that's when we move from the Mahayana path onto the Vajrayana path. And once we are at that level and we've developed that level of spiritual attainment, we can start working at both on the cushion and off the cushion, resting in the nature of the mind, trying to figure out what that means, using different techniques and meditation guidelines to help us understand that nature of our mind while we're meditating, so that when we're off the cushion, we can go around in the world and not have attachment and fixation to anything that exists, and we can rest in our nature, our divine nature, and the divinity of everything that is around us. So an overall picture of what this teaching is about. Once again, very profound, very pith, and what can we learn from it on the way? As you might all know, I'm very much into teaching about the path. So I've had a couple of different teachings, and I'm very interested, partly because I need to know. It's like I need to know how this all fits together so I know how I'm progressing, and I need to know what I need to learn at the different stages so that I can progress on to the next stage. And through my learning this and teaching this, I'm really realizing it all fits together. It is what we're learning to meditate on isn't just for meditation's sake. It's for helping us transform habitual patterns that we have at each of those 4 different stages, and so that we can live a good life. Kempo always tells us this is about living a good life. Of course, we have that lofty goal of reaching total enlightenment for the welfare of all beings. And we may not get to that goal, and we probably won't get to that goal in this lifetime, but having that set so high, it also gives us the inherent techniques and practices to live a good life. And there isn't anything better than that, right? So these are good teachings. And so that's why I like to teach about the path. So when we talked last time, there were also a lot of questions that came up about conduct and what does conduct look like? Because oftentimes we're also, thou shalt not. And within our own traditions that we grew up in, as well as in Buddhism, there are thou shalt nots. And how do we, so I thought about that since the last time we met, like how do we actually take a look at that and see what can we do? What should we do? How do we practice goodness on that path? And each of those stages has different conduct that's associated with them. And so the conduct, when you are just starting the path and starting to turn inward, are the 10 virtuous actions of body, speech, and mind. And those are what we typically think of. That the non-virtuous actions are thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not have any kind of misconduct. But there's the alternative, the antidote to those habitual patterns that we should try to cultivate. So what do we try to cultivate when we're just starting on the path? We try to cultivate the virtuous actions of body, speech, and mind. And so instead of thou shalt nots, the body is the virtuous actions of the body are protecting life. What can we actively do to protect life? We can practice generosity, and we can follow the rules of discipline. For speech, instead of sowing discord, instead of harsh speech, and instead of worthless chatter, there's an antidote to those. What can we practice? What can we habituate ourselves to? And those are telling the truth, helping people reconcile disputes instead of creating disputes, speaking pleasantly, and reciting prayers. So very practical things you can do for yourself and things you can do out in the world with others. And then finally, of mind, being generous, cultivating a desire to help others, and establishing an authentic view. Those are what we can do with our mind. Those are the conduct that we can engage in off the cushion when we're just at the beginning, and then we'll carry those through with us as we continue on our path and our journey. For the second stage of the path, so when we've entered the Hinayana path, there is then a very detailed level that the Hinayana work with. So when we have started working on renunciation, or when we've achieved renunciation, when we're renunciating our attachment to samsara, which basically means we're renunciating our attachment to suffering, we can change that suffering. The Buddha's first turning of the wheel gave us the Fourfold Noble Path, right? And the Fourfold Noble Path is suffering exists, suffering arises, suffering ceases, and there's a path leading away from suffering. So that's the very basic teaching that we should all know. The beauty about that is if suffering arises and suffering ceases, it means it exists in this mundane world. It doesn't exist in nirvana, right? Nirvana is the opposite of that. So that is where things don't arise and don't cease. They just are, that underlying ultimate reality. But if something arises and something ceases, there's a way to help it lead away from being there. We have a path to help us to get to that point where we have no more suffering. And for the Hinayana, that's the Eightfold Path. And I'm not going to go into it in much detail because once again, we could be here for weeks on end. But then the conduct is, and it's an easy way to remember it because there are 8 rights: right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. So only a couple of those relate to meditation: mindfulness and concentration. All of the rest of those are how do we conduct ourselves in our day-to-day life? How do we live a good life? How are we mindful of all the things that we do? And then how do we take that out into the world with us? Wonderful teachings, helping us to live a good life. And if we follow those, it is said, our suffering will decrease because of karma and cause and effect. We have an effect on that. And so the conduct of the next two, the conduct of the Mahayana, is once again the 6 paramitas. We're very familiar with those 6 paramitas. Mary's teaching on them again this time, right? And so being generous, being diligent, having right effort again, an aspect of mindfulness, and thinking more of others than of ourselves. Those are the conduct of the Mahayana. The conduct of Vajrayana is a little bit more difficult to get our minds around because we have to be at that level before we can have that conduct, right? We have to realize the nature of our mind in order to go out into the world and see everything as illusory. It's a little bit hard for us to get our minds around because we haven't necessarily had that realization on the cushion of realizing the nature of our mind, being present in the true nature. Once we have that experience, we can start working on cultivating it on the cushion and then bringing it out into the world. So it's a little bit ephemeral for us at this point in time. And therefore, once again, why it's important to think of this as a path. We don't have very many Mother Teresas in the world. We don't have very many Mozarts in the world, and we don't have very many Steve Jobs in the world. And the reason why I pulled them out as examples because I think of Mother Teresa as someone who has the epitome of that generosity, that feeling. Not all of us can be born a Mother Teresa. We have to work at it. We have to work at having that level of kindness. It's not something that comes automatically to us. We all have that seed of love and kindness in us, and all of us have some degree of love and kindness that we exhibit in the world. Usually we're kind and friendly to those that we love. We're neutral to those that we don't know, and then we have a level of aversion to those who we think of as our enemies. Our job is to try to engage and to have more and more kindness in us. You think about Steve Jobs, superb intellect, right? Not a lot of us are born with that superb intellect. If we want to have some kind of a technical skill, we have to work at it from day one until we've accomplished that goal and then go on to the next goal. You can't start creating amazing computer programs until you learn how to code, right? There's a path there. And then the same things with the musical genius. Not all of us are born as musical geniuses. We need to practice our scales over and over and over again until we're bothering our parents and our friends because those scales get to be a little bit annoying. And then once we've mastered those scales, we can go on and we can learn a few rudimentary songs. Once we've learned a few rudimentary songs, we can go on and perhaps add a little bit of feeling, and maybe we'll get to that level of Mozart. Maybe we won't, but we'll be able to enjoy that musical instrument that we've dedicated and habituated ourselves to practicing, just like Buddhahood. So it's not as easy as we tend to think it is, and I think it's important for us then to go back and remind ourselves of where we are on that path, and how do we get from point A to point B to point C to point D, and thus on down the line. So then, we'll start today talking a little bit more, since we talked about last time attachment to this life, attachment to samsara, talk about attachment to our own self-interest. So we've moved from being a Hinayana practitioner to being a Mahayana practitioner. And what does that mean for us? How do we work with that? There are ways to work with it on the cushion, and there are ways to work with it when we're not on the cushion. And how do we have patience with ourselves in terms of, yeah, of course we are attached to our own self-interest. We need to survive in this world, right? But then how do we practically work at increasing that compassion towards others? There are traditionally many different meditations that we can do, and we've all been taught those meditations. There's 3 of them that I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about. The first is, of course, exchanging self and others. There's a very technical skill that we have learned of how we do that when we're meditating, exchanging self and others, taking on someone else's pain, giving them all of our joy and happiness and health and well-being. And we have an ability to do that. We also have another one where we think about our own mother and think about all the things that our mother has done for us. This very traditional Tibetan way of thinking about generating love and kindness. And then thinking about how everybody in the world has at one time been our mother. And how do we pay back that kindness? Now in the West, oftentimes, we're asked to maybe take a look at someone else who's been kind to us. So I'd like to say, even like if you had a high school teacher or a junior high school teacher or someone who took you under their wing at some point in time, how did that person help you become a better person? And therefore then how can you go and help someone else to be a better person? So not just sitting on the cushion thinking about that, but actually taking time and analyzing it in your own life. How did someone help me and why did they help me? And they didn't have to, but then how can I go back and help them as well? Not necessarily help them, but help others the way that I've been helped. I know that Khenpo has often talked about his own teacher, Petse Rinpoche, who he was an attendant for. And he was always thinking about, how can I help him? This teacher has helped me so much. What can I do from every little thing, like bringing him tea or thinking of things that he might need to help him? His mind was always trained at thinking, how can I help my teacher? Because this person has taught me so much. How can I pay him back? So even things like that, that's a way we can shift the way that we're thinking. Another way to expand your compassion is to be in a point when you are actually suffering yourself. When you're going through a painful illness, when you've gone through a great loss, when there's tremendous difficulty in your life, when you feel like all your hope is gone, what can you do at that point in time, right? Because when you're experiencing that kind of pain and suffering, you don't have anything to give. And that's a time when often we're just thinking about our own self. Help me get through this. How do I get through this? How do I survive this pain? Well, there's a technique for that, right? And that's what they often call is taking what you're experiencing onto the path. And it's a technique of utilizing your mind and saying, and praying and thinking and meditating on, may all people who have this kind of pain and suffering that I'm going through, may I take it all on for everybody else. Now, in reality, you're not going to take on everybody else's pain that's going through that type of suffering. You're changing the way you're thinking, though. You're utilizing your pain to bring good into the world because you're changing the way that your mind operates in the world. Or may all the suffering that I'm experiencing be of some use so that no one else has to ever go through this kind of pain again. Please, Buddha, help me to take on all this suffering of everybody else. Help me be useful so that this pain won't ever affect anyone else again. It's not really going to be such that you're going to take on everybody else's pain. That's going to affect a change in you. And when you get through that difficult time, you'll be a changed person, not just because you'll be physically healthier, but your mind will be different as well. So those are really great techniques that we can use to help us change the way that we are in the world. And then because we change the way we are in the world, we become a better person. We're better able and equipped to help other people as well. So that's my high-level overview of what I wanted to talk about of parting from the third attachment, which is our own self-interest, and developing relative bodhicitta. Very high level. We've all heard many teachings on this before. Now, the fourth one is actually about developing ultimate bodhicitta. So there's attachment in the view. And we work at letting go of all attachment all the time. And now, anytime that we're working with parting from attachment, we're inherently working with the 12 links of interdependent origination. And basically, I look at the 12 links of interdependent origination as how do habits form? Basically, this whole program of Buddhism is looking at how do we form habits and how do we change those habits, right? And we form, and the 12 links of interdependent origination tell us how habits are formed. We've got habits that we developed long before we were ever conscious of them, and we bring them with us. And then because of those habits, we have karma, and we continually develop those habits. But when we look at where we are right now, and we start looking at meditating and looking inward, we're able to be mindful and be more aware of those habits as we're actually developing them. And we're able to counter them by meditating with analytical meditation and shamatha meditation, by looking at our thoughts and being aware of them in the moment. And that's where, in those 12 links, we have a sense object, we have our sensory apparatus, and they come in contact with each other. Being mindful of when our senses come in contact with a sensory object, and just being mindful of it and watching it, being aware of it, and noticing, are we grasping onto it? Are we following it? Are we hanging on to it? And by watching it, that lessens that power of grasping. And by lessening that power of grasping, we're lessening the power of becoming. And that's where I say that's where it becomes a pattern. It becomes a habit. And we're breaking that habitual pattern so that we don't become that next phase, and we're just in the moment and we've broken a habit. And that happens at every stage along the path. In the beginning, and we grasp at some things because we're afraid of them going away, right? That's the underlying all of it all, is everything changes, nothing stays the same. So we grasp at something because we want it to stay the same. So in the beginning, that truth of impermanence helps us to get onto the path. In the middle, it impels us to practice well. And in the end, it helps us to realize the nature of our mind. Because in the nature of the mind is basically we're just resting in the nature of the mind. And I love the word resting because we're resting. We're not grasping the nature of the mind. We're just existing in it. We're just letting everything be as it is. And we always hear our teachers talk about just let it be, just rest. We could rest now, then it's helpful in between analytical meditation, but if we're just resting now, we're not really resting in the nature of our mind. We have to get to that point in time so that we can rest in that nature. Does that make sense? And so as we move from that Mahayana practitioner to that Vajrayana practitioner, we think of those stages along the way and what has a bodhisattva done. There's two kinds of grasping. Well, there's a lot of types of grasping, but there are two types of grasping. There's the grasping to yourself, and there's the grasping to phenomena. And I know this year Kempo is, I think, planning on teaching us about Madhyamaka, so he's going to go into a lot of depth about Madhyamaka, and something that you learn in the Mahayana path, and that grasping to self and to phenomena. But as a bodhisattva who has practiced letting go of grasping to the self, because they have now achieved the ability to think of others more than themselves, They have let go of grasping to themselves, and they are now engulfed in relative bodhicitta. The Vajrayana practitioner then works on letting go of grasping to phenomena as truly existence. Once again, the techniques on the cushion are different than the techniques on the cushion of a Mahayana. In the Mahayana, you're practicing all these different techniques of thinking of others more than yourself, exchanging self and others, helping others more than you can. The techniques when you're on the Vajrayana path are more analytical in nature. You're analyzing, where does mind come from? Where does it go? Where does it reside? Things of that nature. You're analyzing any particular set of instructions that your teacher has given to you. You're also working with visualizations. That's where we're working with the development and completion stages. And you're starting to work with the energies of your body. So you're really going inward using these visualizations in the hopes that as you continue to practice them and become more refined, your body and your mind and your speech start letting go of that grasping of that external phenomena, and you start having realizations either on your own or through pointing out instructions of that nature of your mind. So then we progress onto those types of meditations where we are, the analytical meditation helps us to establish the view of emptiness so we understand what it means. And then the practices help us to gain an inherent understanding of emptiness and then bring in that clarity of that Buddha nature.